Greetings and welcome back to Room 303 in our Talks with Walt, as we are calling our readings through the deathbed edition of Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass. We turn now to a little poem, France, the 18th Year of These States. This is the number 4 poem in the Birds of Passage section. Now, our assumption is that you've been following our stuff at learnstrong.net. Down the left-hand side, find our playlist. We've been messing around with poems ever since the very beginning with inscriptions. We did give a set of introductory comments for Birds of Passage. We've already commented on Song of the Universal as well as Pioneers, O Pioneers, and To You. And now we turn to this very interesting little poem. Now, as we've often done, we will start with Norton's, and we are told that this remained unchanged in title since its first appearance in the 1860 edition. This was appropriately included in a small group entitled Songs of Insurrection. We'll get to why in a bit. In the editions of 1871, 1876. Walt Whitman is, of course, commemorating the year 1794 of the French Revolution, that climactic year of the Revolutionary Tribunal. The text has undergone but slight revision from its first manuscript reading. Now, the poem can be seen as very controversial, and certainly even was for its day. Americans were, of course, always going to struggle with the question of the French Revolution, especially because of the guillotine and some of the other challenges that were a part of that. Let's go ahead now and read the poem and exegete as we go. We'll take it stanza by stanza. A great year and place, a harsh, discordant natal scream outsounding to touch the mother's heart closer than any yet. Now, we'll begin, of course, by, obviously, he calls it a great year, that is to say, 1794. The question is obviously, given especially the culmination of the Reign of Terror, to what degree was it a great year and a place? Notice all of these adjectives, like harsh, all the way through this poem, that makes us wonder, is he celebrating what's going on, or is he have some serious problems with what's going on? Most will read this poem as celebration of some of the crazy violence of that year, and obviously all surrounding them. Discordant, and then the word natal. We're going to get mother imagery happening here all the way to the final word of the poem, ma femme. The idea of birthing as well as happening. Natal scream, and then interesting phrasing, out sounding, to touch the mother's heart closer than any yet. Now, who is the mother and who is ma femme? It's usually understood as democracy. So we're going to see Whitman, the politician, now. I walked the shores of my eastern sea, notice capitalized, and we know that Whitman loved to do this, and we're told that he would even recite Homer as he walked along the beach. Heard over the waves the little voice, we're going to hear more of this in a little bit, saw the divine infant where she woke mournfully, wailing amid the roar of cannon, curses, shouts, crash of falling buildings, was not so sick from the blood in the gutters running, nor from the single corpses, nor those in heaps, nor those borne away in the tumbrils, was not so desperate at the battues of death, was not so shocked at the repeated fuselages of the guns. Now, this is a disturbing stanza in this poem. Notice he'll begin by saying he heard this little voice. As we said, we're going to come back to it. And this divine infant takes us back to the natal scream of earlier, where she woke mournfully. Obviously, we're talking democracy here, right? Wailing, we'll come back to this word later in the poem. Amid, and then he's got this list of what war will be. Now, put it in your notes. We're going to hear more of this in the deathbed edition of Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass when we come to the drum taps section, and obviously his representation of the Civil War. And what is that? Cannon, curses, shouts, crash. You hear all these hard CK sounds of falling buildings. But then he says, was not so sick. In other words, almost like I knew this was necessary in the birthing process. Was not so sick from the blood in the gutters running, nor from the single corpses, nor those in heaps. We're going to hear more about this in our study of drum taps. Nor those borne away in the tumbrils, the carts, right, for all the dead. Was not so desperate at the battues, the helpless crowds, right, all of those who are being beaten down of death. And then the use of the dash makes us think of Emily Dickinson, right? Was not so shocked at the repeated fuselages of the guns. So in other words, he almost seems to be arguing what we've seen already in Leaves of Grass, that the theodicy question we'll come to here in a moment, of why must there be these terrible wars? Whitman the pacifist, Whitman who longs for no war, will seem to be suggesting that there's a certain necessity of a certain kind of violence to produce this birth of democracy. Then he'll continue, pale, silent, stern, and now he'll ask a series of 4 questions, which seems to suggest that his theodicy is not why did this happen to France, but why did this happen for France? And again, we've seen this before in his discussions of especially the American Civil War. Pale, silent, stern. What could I say to that long accrued retribution? In other words, people got what they deserved. It seems to be what he's suggesting. Could I wish humanity different? It's a funny question given what we've already read of Leaves of Grass, because it does seem that he will in some ways hope that humanity could be different. Could I wish the people made of wood and stone? In other words, they're humans, and they were repressed for so long, it was inevitable this was the way they were going to respond. And then he finishes with the last question, or that there be no justice in destiny or time. His use of the word justice obviously has a powerful resonance, and the idea is here that what happened was in some ways not only necessary, but also just. Now, of course, any close study of the French Revolution, and especially that year of 1794, and the Reign of Terror, as it was called, have a hard time looking at what Whitman says here as justice. Although, I suppose you could make the argument that he's going to say that what happened was inevitable and therefore just. Then he goes to the use of this "oh." We're going to see it 2 more times after this time here in the poem. "Oh, liberty," notice the exclamation point. "Oh, mate for me." So notice he goes from mother now to this mate argument, and we're going to finish with ma femme, and he's talking obviously about democracy, personifying her as somehow female or feminine. Then we're going to give 4 heres, and it's not clear what he means by here. Is he talking about France, because that's the title of the poem, or is he talking about America? Here too, the blaze, the grape shot and the axe in reserve, to fetch them out in case of need. It almost seems as if he's saying what happened in France could easily happen in America if a certain understanding of oppression starts to take place. Here too, though long repressed, what can never be destroyed. Here too could rise at last murdering and ecstatic. Boy, what an interesting juxtaposition of those 2 words. Here too demanding full arrears of vengeance. And many have read these lines as very threatening, and therefore have seen this as one of the more radical poems of Leaves of Grass. Hence, he says, I sign this salute over the sea. And I do not deny that terrible red birth and baptism, using now religious language as well. But remember the little voice, again from the beginning of the poem, that I heard wailing, and wait with perfect trust. We've talked about Whitman as optimist. Some call him blind optimist. We've called him an informed optimist. Perfect trust, no matter how long. In other words, democracy will be born no matter how long it takes, right? And from today, sad and cogent, notice how both sides of the polarity, I maintain the bequeathed cause as for all lands. We'll get to this again when we study Passage to India. And I send these words to Paris with my love. This now is legacy, right? And I guess some chansonnets, that is to say the songwriters, the French songwriters there, will understand them. Now, I think here, very subtly, and this is interesting, right? The way that Whitman plays this game. Very subtly, he seems to be suggesting to the French poets, I'm one of you, and therefore I hope that you will embrace my Leaves of Grass. Of course, Whitman, interestingly, was embraced far more by Europeans early on than he was by his own people, the Americans. For I guess there is latent music yet in France, floods of it. Oh, I hear already the bustle of instruments. It's almost like a symphony is beginning to prepare, practicing to get ready for their performance. They will soon be drowning all that would interrupt them. We think of this word drowning. It's a fascinating use of this word because it seems to be celebration, and yet the word drowning obviously usually means death. Or it can mean, of course, overcoming, or as as Yeats will use it in Second Coming, something very pejorative. Oh, he says, oh, I think the east wind brings a triumphal and free march. We've heard about this marching, obviously, in Pioneers, O Pioneers. It reaches hither, it swells me to joyful madness. By the way, the only use of that phrase in all Leaves of Grass, joyful madness, is here. Think about what the French Revolution was. It's kind of remarkable that Whitman seems to be playing almost prophet here, and he says about the French Revolution it was joyful madness, which obviously is a confliction. It's hyperbolic to use this kind of language. I will run, we've heard this already in Leaves of Grass, I will run, transpose it in words to justify it. I will yet sing a song for you, ma femme. You know, obviously, literally my woman, but here obviously he's personifying democracy, no question. This idea of to justify immediately reminds us of Milton's Paradise Lost, to justify the ways of God to men. We've given lectures at learnstrong.net on Paradise Lost. But I think that what Whitman is doing is saying there is a certain theodictic view that I have, theodicy, why do bad things have to happen? And it is simply this: necessary violence for the promulgation of democracy. Why? Because to a democracy can't be stopped. Out of the violence will rise some peace. Now obviously this will lead us at 3b to have some serious questions about his view. At 2b, notice the interesting obscure French words that are being utilized here, and of course his speaking directly to the French people, especially the poets of France. At 3a, well, obviously we've got a whole lot of text that could come to mind here. I just want to mention 3. Edmund Burke's, of course, Reflections on the Revolution in France, published in 1790. Remember this poem, 1860. Significant. We've given a full lecture on this text at learnstrong.net. Burke obviously had serious problems with what happened in the French Revolution. You'll remember Wordsworth's The Prelude from 1850. You remember these words, quote, "But now become oppressors," he's talking about the French, "but now become oppressors in their turn. Frenchmen had changed a war of self-defense for one of conquest, losing sight of all which they had struggled for." And of course Wordsworth, a romantic British poet, and we've given full lecture on this passage elsewhere at learnstrong.net, he had such great hope for what he thought he was about to witness, and of course it all turned rather tragic for him. Some have argued that it pretty much destroyed his political optimism and forced him to turn more into interior to try and find some peace and joy there. And obviously the last text we'll mention in 3a, I say obvious because we study it in 303 and we love it, is Dickens' Tale of Two Cities. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. And that text, you'll remember, is 1859. And so you can kind of get a sense that in the air was this real debate. What's happened and continues to happen in France, is it a good thing or is it a bad thing, especially as it relates to to issues of democracy, right? And finally at 3b, I have students that really wrestle with this poem. I will say that out loud. I'll ask a couple of questions to help you kind of own it. What are your views? And I'll usually qualify them as plural, right? Because we have different understandings of it. What are your views of the French Revolution? And more particularly, do you think violence is ever justified to accomplish some greater good? There's a good argument to be made that if you use violence, a la the French Revolution, especially that Reign of Terror, you can't in any way find that somehow or another what grows out of that is anything other than tragic. You can't see it the way Whitman sees it, that it's kind of a necessary evil. Others will look at any number of these kinds of revolutions and say, well, it was kind of what has to happen to produce the growth. And of course, it was Jefferson himself that talked about growing trees from bloodshed. So, I mean, it's an interesting debate. I will leave it to you. We move on to myself and mine, the next poem in this Birds of Passage section, right? Thank you.